My name is Elaine Booker, and for 19 years, my only daughter believed I was the reason her father was dead. Not the accident, not the ice on Route 7 that December night, not the fact that her father had been driving home from a woman's apartment 2 towns over. Me. She blamed me, and the people who loved her made sure that blame stayed lit like a candle that never burned out. I was 63 years old when my daughter called me from her new house in Alpharetta, Georgia, the house I'd never been invited to see, the house her husband's family helped them buy, the house where my granddaughter was growing up not knowing my name. The call came on a Wednesday. I was in my kitchen in Charlotte making coffee. I probably didn't need watching the November light come through the window over the sink. When I saw the number, my hand went still. I hadn't heard her voice in 4 years. Mom. Not Elaine. Not a stranger's formality. Mom. Not Elaine. Not a stranger's formality. Mom. But the word had no warmth in it. It was a key in a lock. A tool. She told me she was having a dinner party. A big one. Her husband's business partners, her in-laws, her whole new life arranged on a table she'd set without me. She said she wanted me there. Said her mother-in-law had asked about me, that it would look strange if I wasn't present. There was a pause. Then she said, real casual, like it cost her nothing. You can come. Show everyone you're still around. Show them the woman Dad always said you were. I knew what that meant. Her father's version of me. The selfish one. The cold one. The woman who'd driven him away with her ambitions and her opinions and her refusal to be small enough for him to feel large. I'd heard that version so many times it used to make me doubt my own memories. I'll be there, I said, and I hung up before she could hear anything in my voice. Then I sat down in my kitchen and let out a long breath. My daughter had just handed me an invitation to her own ambush. She expected me to show up the way I always had before, quiet, a little shabby around the edges, hoping to be let back in. She had no idea who I'd become since the last time she'd seen me. But to understand why she thought so little of me, I have to take you back to when I was just Elaine Murray from Greensboro, a woman who married the wrong man at 31 and spent the next 20 years trying to make it right. His name was Dennis Booker, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who made a room feel like it had a center. I was working as an office manager at an insurance firm when we met. He was a sales rep with an easy smile and a talent for making you feel like the most important person in any conversation. We got married 14 months after our first date. My mother cried at the wedding. And not only from happiness, she had said something to me the night before. Something I didn't want to hear at the time. She said, baby, a man who always needs to be the most impressive person in the room will eventually resent you for having your own light. I told her she was wrong. I was 31 and in love and certain I knew things she didn't. Our daughter was born 2 years later. We named her Lily. She had Dennis's eyes and my stubbornness, and from the moment I held her, she was the most real thing in my life. I would have done anything for that child. I did do everything. Dennis travels for work 5 days a week, came home on weekends with stories and a duffel bag full of laundry, and an appetite for a home that had kept running in his absence. And I kept it running. I handled Lily's school, her doctors, her friends' birthday parties, the leaking pipe under the bathroom sink, the property taxes, the grocery runs at 7 a.m. on Saturday before anyone else woke up. I did it without complaint because I thought that was what love looked like. Showing up, keeping things whole. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know for years, was that Dennis had been building a separate life, not dramatically, not all at once. Just slowly, carefully, the way rot works through wood. A woman in Concord he'd met at a sales conference. Phone calls at odd hours he explained away with time zones and demanding clients. Hotel receipts I found once and believed his story about. Because I wanted to believe it. Because believing the alternative meant looking at 19 years and seeing something I couldn't fix. The night Dennis died, he had told me he was driving to his brother's place in Kannapolis. It was December 11th. I made dinner. I put Lily to bed. I waited up until midnight, fell asleep on the couch, and woke to a knock at the door at 2 a.m., a highway patrol officer, and the chaplain standing in the porch light. Dennis had gone off Route 7 on a patch of black ice. He was killed on impact. The investigation later showed he'd been coming from an address in China Grove, not his brother's house, not even close. The grief I felt was real. Even knowing what I came to know later, the grief was real. You can love someone imperfectly and still feel the specific emptiness of their absence. I won't pretend otherwise. But Dennis's family had a different story to tell. His mother, a fierce woman named Rose, who had never fully forgiven me for being someone her son chose without her input, moved fast. Before the funeral flowers had wilted, she was already shaping the narrative. She pulled Lily close and whispered things into the soft ear of a 14-year-old girl who had just lost her father. She said Dennis had been unhappy, that he'd confided in her about the marriage, that I had been distant, difficult, more interested in my own plans than in the family I'd made. She wasn't wrong that I had plans. By the time Dennis died, I'd been taking night classes for 2 years, working toward a real estate license. Dennis had mocked it, called it my hobby, said I was wasting time and money on a midlife crisis. But I kept going because something in me knew, maybe always had known, that I needed something that was mine. Rose turned that into evidence against me. Lily was 14 and devastated and looking for somewhere to put her pain, and her grandmother handed her a target. By the time Lily was 16, she wouldn't eat dinner at the table with me. By 17, she had moved in with Rose. By the time she left for college, she called me Elaine. Not Mom. Elaine. Like I was a neighbor she tolerated. I tried everything. Therapy she refused to attend. Letters she didn't answer. Birthday calls she let go to voicemail. One Christmas, I drove 4 hours to leave a gift on Rose's doorstep because Lily was staying there for the holiday, and I knew if I knocked, Rose would answer. The gift was still there on the step when I drove past again 2 days later. Hadn't been brought inside, just sat there in the December cold. I stopped crying about it the way you stop bleeding from a wound that's healed over scar tissue. The pain didn't leave, it just changed form. I passed my real estate exam 8 months after Dennis died. I got my license. I started working at a small agency in Charlotte, the kind of place where they hand you a desk and a phone book and say good luck. I was 51 years old, starting over in a field I'd only studied in the margins of an already full life. The other agents were mostly younger and mostly indifferent. One man in the office, a 29-year-old named Travis who'd sold $1 million in property his first year, looked at me on my first day like he was doing math that didn't add up. I sold my first house 11 weeks after I started. A 3-bedroom bungalow in Plaza Midwood to a young couple who'd been looking for 6 months. I sat across from them at the closing table and watched them sign, and something quiet and solid happened in my chest. I had found the thing I was good at. What I was good at, specifically, was listening. Dennis had taught me that, accidentally. All those years of learning what he actually meant versus what he said had made me fluent in subtext. Buyers would say they wanted open floor plans and good school districts. But what they meant was safety, a fresh start, room to become the family they were hoping to be. I heard the real thing under the stated thing, and I matched them accordingly. My close rate was absurd. By my 3rd year, I was outselling everyone in the office. By my 5th, I'd left and opened my own firm. It was called Booker Realty Group, and I know some people thought it was strange to keep his name. But I had built my professional reputation under that name. I had clients who knew me as Elaine Booker, and honestly, I had earned that name in ways Dennis never had. I wasn't keeping it for him. I was keeping it because it was mine now. The business grew steadily. I focused on a niche that most agents didn't want to bother with: estate sales and probate properties. Complicated paperwork, grieving families, houses that needed work and patience, and a broker who didn't flinch at ugly circumstances. It was, in some ways, everything I'd been trained for by my own life. By year 7, I had 3 agents working under me. By year 10, a full staff of 12 and a second office in Concord of all places. I lived simply. My house was modest, a 2-bedroom in Dilworth I'd bought and renovated myself over 2 years. I drove a used Lexus. I didn't advertise my income. Old habit from the years when being visible felt dangerous. But I built quietly, carefully, the way I built everything. The call that changed things, the one from Lily, came the November of my 63rd year. She'd been married for 3 years to a man named Craig, who worked in commercial finance. I knew this from Rose, who occasionally sent me brief impersonal updates that I think were designed to sting. I knew about the house in Alpharetta, the granddaughter I'd never met, the life being built without me in it. When Lily's name appeared on my phone that Wednesday morning, I stood at the kitchen counter for 2 full rings, just breathing. I knew what was coming, not the specific words, but the shape of them. She wanted me at a dinner party. A Saturday 3 weeks out. Craig's business partners, his parents. A statement evening, the kind where the table settings matter and the wine is chosen in advance. She said her mother-in-law had asked about me, had apparently been under the impression that we were close, and that it might look strange if I wasn't there. Her voice was smooth, practiced. Then the edge came through. "You can sit with the rest of the guests," she said. "I just think everyone should finally meet the real you." There it was. Her grandmother's voice coming out of her mouth 20 years on. I told her I'd be there. I kept my tone even. I said it the way I say most things that matter. Quietly, without decoration. After I hung up, I sat for a long moment, looking at the coffee I hadn't drunk. My daughter had just invited me to be humiliated in front of the life she'd built. She was expecting the version of me that showed up apologetic and grateful to be included. She did not know about the firm. She did not know about the portfolio. She did not know what I'd spent 12 years becoming while she'd been busy inheriting her grandmother's opinion of me. But I want to be honest about something. Even then, sitting in that kitchen, the feeling underneath the strategy wasn't triumph. It was grief, the particular grief of a mother who has watched her child become a stranger and doesn't know how to cross back to her. I wasn't planning to perform power. I was planning to make it impossible for my daughter to keep choosing a lie over a living person. There was something else she didn't know about. A piece of information I'd been sitting on for nearly 2 years. A woman named Audrey had found me. Audrey had been Dennis's neighbor in China Grove, the building where he kept a second apartment for nearly 8 years. She was 71, retired and apparently at peace with her conscience until a minor stroke the previous spring had made her feel otherwise. Her grandson had tracked down my firm's number. She'd called on a Tuesday afternoon, and I'd taken the call in my car in a parking garage, which is where I sit when I need to think. Audrey told me that Dennis had lived a complete second life, that Rose had known about it for years and had visited him there, that 2 weeks before the accident, Dennis had told Audrey he was planning to formalize the arrangement, which meant, as best Audrey could interpret, that he intended to ask me for a divorce and give Rose the chance to fully separate Lily from me. Audrey said she'd seen Rose at Dennis's apartment the week before he died, that there had been conversations about me, about what kind of mother I was, what kind of wife, what story would serve them best if things became public. She was willing to put it in writing. I'd sat in that parking garage for 40 minutes after the call ended, not crying, just sitting, because what Audrey had given me wasn't just the truth. It was the truth in a form that could reach my daughter. I hired an attorney. Her name was Wanda, and she was 67 years old, had been practicing family law in Charlotte since before I'd graduated high school, and had the patient, unblinking manner of someone who had heard every version of every story and was impossible to surprise. I laid everything out on her conference table. Audrey's account, Dennis's phone records, which I'd managed to pull together over the prior year through a very patient private records search, a birthday card I'd found in Dennis's things after he died, signed with a name that wasn't mine and a tenderness that made clear it wasn't the first. Wanda read everything without comment. Then she looked up at me. "You've been sitting on this for how long?" "Almost 2 years," I said. She nodded, unsurprised. "You wanted to be sure." "I wanted to be sure," I said. "And I wanted to be in a position where showing my daughter the truth didn't look like desperation." She understood. The 3 weeks between the phone call and the dinner party, I made preparations. Quietly. The way I do things. I called my firm manager, Darlene, and told her I'd be in Alpharetta for the weekend. I booked a room at the Waldorf in Buckhead. Not to impress anyone else, but because I needed the specific composure that comes from having a good night's sleep in a quiet room. I bought a dress, dark green, the kind of structured elegance that doesn't announce itself loudly, but reads unmistakably in a room. I packed Wanda's documents in a portfolio case. I also printed 12 years of business records, nothing detailed. Just the summary documents, the kind of banker reviews. I brought them not as weapons. I brought them as truth in a form that couldn't be talked around. The dinner was at 7, I arrived at 5 past, which in the South is still on time. The house was a large colonial on a cul-de-sac, beautifully kept, warm light in every window. Cars lined the driveway. When I rang the bell, a woman I didn't know answered. I assumed a catering person, and I gave my name and stepped inside. The foyer opened into a great room where guests were holding wine glasses and talking in small clusters. I heard my daughter's laugh before I saw her, her real laugh, the one she'd had since she was small, bright and a little too loud. The laugh I used to love hearing from the next room. Then she turned and saw me. The expression that crossed her face wasn't what she'd planned. She'd planned something cooler. What she got, for just a half second, was a look I recognized from when she was 8 years old and had done something she wasn't sure was wrong yet. A flicker of something uncertain. She recovered, came toward me with a hostess smile. "Elaine, you made it." I took her hands and held them. "Mom," I said quietly, "is usually how it goes. But I'll take what I can get." She stiffened. I smiled. The dinner itself was beautiful. The food was excellent. Craig's business partners were polite and a little formal. His parents, Frank and Adele, were warm in the way of people who have been taught manners so thoroughly that warmth is simply the default expression. Adele had asked about me. I could tell. She looked at me with the focused interest of someone reconciling a story she'd been told with a person she was meeting. Rose was there. Of course she was. 78 years old, smaller than I remembered, seated at the far end of the table in a deep burgundy blouse. She looked at me when I walked in, and her face did something complicated and still. I sat where I was placed. I spoke when spoken to. I listened. Over the salmon, Frank asked me what I did. "Real estate," I said. "Residential and estate sales primarily. I own a firm in Charlotte. We have 2 offices now." I watched Craig's attention sharpen. His father's too. "A firm," Adele said. "How long?" 12 years, I said. "We moved about 62 million in property last year." The table wasn't silent, but it shifted. Lily was looking at her plate. It was after dessert that Rose decided to speak. She'd been quiet through most of the meal, which was unusual for a woman who'd spent decades deciding what stories got told in rooms she was in. I think the wine had something to do with what came next. She raised her glass, not quite a toast, more like a clearing of the table. "I want to say something about resilience," she said, "about how Lily has built this beautiful life despite the complications of her childhood." She paused and let her eyes settle on me briefly. "Despite the people who weren't always there the way they should have been." The table went politely uncomfortable. Lily looked up. I expected her to hold her grandmother's line. She'd been doing it for 20 years. But she didn't say anything. She was watching me. I set down my fork. "I appreciate that, Rose," I said. "The word resilience is interesting, though. I've been thinking about resilience a lot lately. What it actually means." I looked around the table. Not at Rose. At everyone else. At Adele and Frank. At Craig. At my daughter. "It means surviving things you didn't deserve and choosing to build anyway." I reached for the portfolio case I'd set beneath my chair. "I have something I'd like to share," I said. "Not to create a scene, but because there are people at this table who are making decisions about my daughter's life based on a version of her history that isn't true." I set the folder on the table. I told them about Audrey, calmly, the way Wanda had coached me. Facts first, emotions second. I told them about Dennis's apartment in China Grove, about the 8 years, about the conversations Rose had been part of in the weeks before his death, about what Audrey had signed, about the phone records. I did not raise my voice. Rose said that's a lie before I'd finished the second sentence. Then she said it again. Then she looked at Lily and said, "She's always done this. She's always tried to twist things." "Mom," Lily said. The word came out flat and strange, directed at Rose. Rose stopped. Craig's father cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps this is a conversation for the family." "Yes," Craig said. He looked at me with a directness I respected. "But we should hear the rest." I finished. I laid the documents on the table. Audrey's statement, a notarized summary Wanda had prepared. The phone records. I did not editorialize. I let the paper speak. The dinner ended quietly. Guests understood without being told that the evening had become something else. They thanked Craig and Lily, collected their things, said warm goodbyes with that particular care people use when they don't want to acknowledge what they've just witnessed. Rose left without speaking to me. I watched her walk out, smaller than she'd been when the evening started. When the last guest was gone, Lily and I were alone in her kitchen. Craig had taken his parents to the living room, giving us space. The catering staff was moving quietly in the background. Lily stood at the sink with her back to me for almost a full minute. When she turned around, her face was doing all the things she'd been trained since adolescence, not to show in front of me. The confusion. The years of accumulated uncertainty she'd buried under her grandmother's certainty. "Why didn't you ever fight harder?" she said. Her voice cracked at the end. "Why did you just let me go?" "I didn't let you go," I said. "I was removed. There's a difference." And fighting harder looked like fighting you, which I wasn't willing to do. She exhaled something that wasn't quite a breath and wasn't quite a sound. "You paid for my study abroad semester," she said. "I thought it was financial aid. It was structured to look that way," I said, "because I knew you wouldn't have accepted it otherwise." Her eyes closed for a second. "The scholarship for sophomore year." "Yes." "And the car when mine broke down. The anonymous Venmo that I always thought was from Craig's parents." "Yes." She stood very still. Outside, the November dark pressed against the kitchen windows. "Why?" she whispered. "After everything I said to you. After how I treated you." "Because you're my daughter," I said. "That isn't conditional." She came apart then. Not loudly. Quietly, the way I always had, shoulders forward, hands pressed over her face, the specific grief of someone who has just realized they've been handed a false map and followed it for 20 years. I crossed the kitchen and put my arms around her. She let me. We stood there in her kitchen for a long time, not saying anything. I wasn't fixing 19 years in that moment. I wasn't winning anything. I was just finally in the same room with my daughter, without a lie, standing between us. 3 months later, on a gray February morning, Wanda called me from her office. The district attorney in Cabarrus County had reviewed Audrey's statement along with the supporting documentation. Rose Booker would not face criminal charges. The statute of limitations on most of what she'd done had long passed. But the family court judge who had signed off on the original custody arrangements years ago had agreed to expunge certain false affidavits from the record. A formal correction, not a verdict, but something. More importantly, Rose had agreed to sit down with Lily in the presence of a family therapist and tell the truth about Dennis's second household. The conversation, from what Lily told me afterward, lasted 3 hours. Rose cried. She said she thought she was protecting the family, that she'd convinced herself, over the years, that her version of events was close enough to true. Lily said quietly that she didn't think her grandmother was a bad person, just a person who had loved a son more than she'd been willing to love the truth about him. I didn't disagree. We started slowly, Lily and I. A phone call on a Sunday evening, then a drive up from Alpharetta one Saturday, just the two of us, walking through uptown Charlotte while I pointed out buildings I'd sold or listed or renovated. She asked smart questions. She had Craig's eye for numbers and Dennis's easy sociability, and underneath both of those, something that was purely her own, a precision in her thinking that I recognized as mine. The first time I met my granddaughter, she was 3.5. Her name was June. She had Lily's eyes and a solemnity about her that made her seem like she was appraising everything she looked at. When Lily introduced me as your grandmother, Elaine, June studied me for a moment and then said very seriously, "You have nice hair." I laughed in a way I hadn't laughed in years. A few months after that, I broke ground on a project I'd been planning since that parking garage phone call from Audrey. A renovated community space in a neighborhood in East Charlotte, a neighborhood I'd grown up adjacent to, one that had been losing its infrastructure for decades, a resource center for women navigating legal and financial systems after major life disruptions. Divorce, job loss, housing instability, the kinds of emergencies that find you when you're already tired. I named it Elaine's house. My attorney Wanda laughed when I told her. I told her I'd spent 40 years going by other people's names for things. Dennis's last name, Rose's version of my character, my daughter's childhood nickname for her resentment. It was time to call something by its right name. At the ribbon cutting, a reporter from the Charlotte Observer asked me to describe the last 12 years in one word. I thought about it. Refusal, I said. The refusal to become what they decided I was. The reporter smiled and wrote it down. I looked out at the building, newly painted, windows that let in the morning light, a ramp at the entrance wide enough for strollers and wheelchairs and every shape of need. Lily stood to my right, June on her hip, one hand resting lightly on my arm. My granddaughter was watching the ribbon with enormous, serious eyes. When the scissors came out, June asked if she could help cut. "Of course you can," I said. She gripped the handle with both small hands. We cut together. The ribbon fell. People clapped. June looked up at me with the particular satisfaction of a child who has just participated in something official. "I know, baby," I told her. "I know. I've thought a lot about what actually happened to my family over those 19 years. Not the events, I know the events by heart, but the mechanism underneath them. How a lie told consistently enough by people with enough authority in a child's eyes becomes indistinguishable from memory. Lily didn't choose to hate me. She was handed a version of me before she was old enough to question where it came from. That's not weakness on her part. That's just what happens when a grieving child is given an explanation that makes her pain feel like someone's fault. What I carry from this isn't bitterness toward Rose. I spent years thinking I should feel more anger than I do, and eventually I understood that the anger I couldn't sustain was because what Rose did came from something recognizable. She loved her son. She loved him past the point of honesty, past the point of fairness, past the point where love stops being a virtue and starts being a way of avoiding the truths about someone you've built your identity around. That's a human failure. An ordinary one. It doesn't excuse what she did to me, or to Lily, but it makes it legible, and legible things lose a certain power over you. The part I think about most is Audrey, a woman I'd never met, who spent 8 years watching something happen from the next apartment over, who carried that weight through a minor stroke and woke up on the other side of it unwilling to die without setting something straight. People underestimate the cost of that kind of honesty. It would have been easier for her to stay quiet. No one was asking. The statute of limitations had run. She did it anyway, because she had looked at what she'd witnessed and decided she didn't want it on her conscience any longer. I owe her something I can never fully repay. What I've learned, not as a lesson I plan to learn, but as something that arrived through living, is that the life you build in the dark counts. Those 12 years when no one was paying attention. When I was selling houses no one else wanted to bother with. When I was sitting in libraries and courthouse records rooms and parking garages putting together a case I wasn't sure I'd ever use. All of it counted, not because it led to a moment of triumph, but because it made me someone who could stand in my daughter's kitchen without needing anything from her. I didn't go to that dinner party to win. I went because I was finally in a position where the truth didn't need me to be desperate for it to land. The intelligence I'm most proud of isn't the business. It's the patience. Knowing when not to act. Knowing that showing my daughter a folder of documents before she had any reason to trust me would have meant nothing. The timing of truth matters as much as the truth itself. And Lily, what she did in that room, the moment she said mom and stopped her grandmother mid-sentence, that took something. It takes real moral clarity to look at a story you've believed for 20 years, with the person who gave it to you sitting right there, and choose the harder version. I don't take credit for that. That was her. June is 4 now. Last week she told me, very seriously, that she wants to be an architect when she grows up, because she likes buildings that look different on the inside than they do on the outside. I told her that was a very good reason. I meant it about more than buildings.